So this is the fifth video, and this continues on from the previous video, which looks at the religious landscape in Australia. Just goes into a little bit more depth with some of the reasons for the changes to the religious landscape over time, which we've already highlighted, but it'll be a little bit of revision and also go into maybe a little bit more depth than the previous video did. So the way we'll break this up is we'll have a look at the state of Christianity in general, and then the changes to Christianity over time, and then we'll have a look at the growth of Pentecostalism, immigration, denominational switching, New Age spiritualities, and the rise of secularism in Australia as well. So, as we've already mentioned, Australia started as a Christian-dominated society, predominantly because we had European, mainly British settlers in Australia from the outset. So those European settlers brought about a whole variety of Christian denominations, and the main ones being obviously Roman Catholic and the Church of England / Anglican Church, as well as a whole bunch of other Protestant churches like the Methodists, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, the Lutheran Church, and the Baptist churches. So again, Christianity was by far and away the most dominant religion in Australia all the way through to the 1950s, essentially. And a lot of that had to do with the White Australia policy, which is the term that we've come to use for what was the Immigration Restriction Act, which came in 1901, which severely limited any opportunities for people from non-European and non-English speaking, generally European countries to come into Australia. So only select European countries were open for immigration into Australia. So that essentially meant that there were very few opportunities for non-Christians to migrate to Australia. So for that reason, on the census we had 88% of Australians indicating that they were Christians and about 10% not indicating anything. So a very, very small percentage of people were indicating that they were of another religion in that census. What we've seen in Australia over time, up to 2011 census data, which is the most recent census, is that Christianity is still the dominant religion in Australia, with 61% of people indicating that they are Christians. However, we've seen a continuous decline in the number of people calling themselves Christians, and we've seen an increase in the number of people of other religions and adhering to no religion. So on top of having a decline in the overall overarching number of Christians, as you can see in this graph there, there's also been a steady decline in the number of people, or number of Christians actually observing Christian services. So number one, we've got less people saying that they're Christians, and that can't be just attributed to immigration. So it can't be just attributed to more non-Christians coming into Australia. It's just less people are becoming Christians, or less people are identifying with Christianity, if that makes sense. So there are a few reasons for the decline in the number of Christian adherents in Australia, as well as the decline in religious observance in regards to Christians here in Australia too. So one of the main reasons is the growing secularisation of Australian society. So people not identifying with religion, wanting to separate the state and church, not considering themselves to be religious at all. Another reason is dissatisfaction. These are all key terms you need to learn, by the way. Secularisation is one. Dissatisfaction with the sort of traditional religious services and movements. People not finding spiritual fulfilment in those churches, and therefore they're moving away from them and not identifying themselves as being Christian anymore. A third factor is the ageing population of Australia, meaning that most of the older people in Australia are maintaining their Christianity, but the younger people are not becoming, and they're not passing on that to the younger generation, I suppose. So that's another reason as well, and a lack of Christian migrant intake. Because if we were taking, I suppose, a spread of people from around the world, you would expect to see maybe more Christians coming into Australia, but there's a lack of Christian migrant intake. And the last thing we need to think about is who's actually been the most affected. Now, we've already mentioned that the Catholic Church has maintained its stability over the past sort of almost 40 years, almost, and in fact climbed a little bit during that period. But we've seen the Anglican Church really take a massive hit, as well as Uniting and Presbyterian churches, who are really hit in terms of both the number of areas that they have and their attendance at religious services as well. Some of the problems that we have with the data is that particularly in regards to church attendance, and we know that church attendance is down, but we don't know how accurate that data is, because it's not always regularly kept by churches, and sometimes it can be overstated. So the decline in the church numbers mightn't be as bad as we think it is. It might be that they were being overstated in the past, and people were saying, well, we have this many attendees at church on a weekly basis, and it might not have been anywhere near that number. Again, as we've already mentioned, there's that growth in Catholicism that we've seen, both as a percentage and as a overall figure, as a number of adherents that we have as well. It is the largest, or it is now the largest religious group in Australia. And again, the reasons for that is that Christian migrant intake. That's the biggest reason for that stability of the Catholics and that increase we've had of Catholics from 1947. So that's one key reason. Another minor reason, and I stress that this is more of a minor reason, is that there is a slightly higher birth rate for Catholics than for people of other religions. So that has had an impact, but it is not a massive impact, nowhere near as significant as the migrant intake. And the third reason, which is pretty significant, is the fact that someone who is baptised as a Catholic generally continues to identify themselves with their Catholicity, even though they're not actually practicing their faith. So they might not go to church, they may not pray, they may not continue to seek the sacraments and those sorts of things, but they will still consider themselves to be a Catholic and adherent. Whereas people who are Protestants and who no longer associate themselves with the church will generally indicate that they're not practicing or no religion. So they would identify themselves more with being, part of the secular movement, more so than they would consider themselves to be, more so than they would consider themselves a Protestant. Whereas in Catholicism, they tend to maintain that association despite their practice or not, whether they're practicing or not. The next thing we're going to have a quick look at is the growth of Pentecostalism. And a bit of background on what the Pentecostal church is and what it is. It's a very charismatic variant of Christianity, and it's evangelical in nature. What that means is that there's a lot of vibrancy in worship, and it's evangelical in that it goes out and seeks to bring other people, I suppose, into the flock. There's lots of particular focuses on this, which are different to other sort of traditional churches. A lot of it is on the literal approach to the Bible, so seeing the Bible as a literal document, not something that should be interpreted in regards to when it was written and who it was written for, but something that can be taken literally. Another one is on personal conversion to Christianity, sort of accepting Jesus as your Lord and Saviour and all those sorts of things. And also really dynamic teaching of the Scripture, and that's the focus. So sermons and those sorts of things are more important than the ritual and the ceremony that we may focus on in sort of more traditional churches, particularly the Catholic and the Orthodox churches and the High Anglican sort of churches, where the focus is more on the liturgy than the sort of dynamic preaching of the word, so to speak. There's an aspect for that, but not to the same extent as you'd see in the Pentecostal church. There's also a massive focus on the gifts of the Holy Spirit and how they're present, and people speaking in tongues and those sorts of things, faith healing and those sorts of things as well. So there's a vibrancy of worship, tendency to have a lot of music and exciting presentations which bring young people across. So that charismatic, and vibrant sort of worship is what has seen there be quite a growth in Christian churches, particularly as the world has modernised, and some people see that these more traditional churches don't meet their needs for spiritual fulfilment, so they go searching for spiritual fulfilment, and they find it, at least for a time, in the Pentecostal church. So unlike a lot of the other Christian adherents, or variants rather, in Australia. Pentecostalism is not in decline at all. There has been a slight increase in numbers over the past sort of 3 or 4 censuses, but nowhere near as much as what we would expect, considering the growth in how obvious and how visible the Pentecostal churches are in Australia. So they're becoming more visible, but we're not seeing the growth that you would expect to see with that visibility. The reasons for that, as we've already mentioned before, is the fact that in 2000, the church leaders of a whole bunch of Pentecostal churches got together and they founded what was called the Australian Christian Churches. And what they were asking people to write on the census is that they belong to the Australian Christian Churches rather than Pentecostal Church, because they wanted to see themselves as something outside of that name or that label, I suppose. So that may be why we're not seeing a massive increase in the Pentecostal church, even though it's becoming more visible. But we're not 100% sure. Another reason why we think there's not the growth that we would expect to see with the visibility of the churches is what we call the revolving door syndrome, which is another term that you need to learn. And that refers to people who really don't stay in the Pentecostal churches for a very long time. They may stay in the churches for between 1.5 to 2 years. That tends to be the sort of time, or the amount of time that people will remain with the Pentecostal church for. They go in there seeking spiritual fulfillment. They spend some time in there. They may find some spiritual fulfillment for a period of time, and then they return to their previous churches, or they move out of the system again. So that's another term that we need to learn, and it's something that can also be attributed to the Pentecostal, or the reasons for probably the less growth than we would expect in the Pentecostal churches. The next point that we're going to look at is immigration, which we've already spent a lot of time speaking about, but we'll go into a little bit more depth here. Obviously, we had a large migrant intake following World War II because Australia really felt that we didn't have the population to become, I suppose, economically powerful and sustaining and self-sufficient, I suppose, on a global scale, and we couldn't protect ourselves and all those sorts of things and develop the infrastructure and the industry that we needed with the population that we had. So we knew we needed to grow, and we needed to grow rapidly. Only way to do that is to have a influx of migrants, and we initially wanted to have British migrants, and we couldn't always get British migrants, and we didn't have enough coming in for what we wanted. We also took in a whole bunch of refugees following World War II. So what we saw is a steady decline in the sort of that Immigration Restriction Act of 1901, and we see other ethnic groups and other people from other countries slowly able to come into Australia over quite a long period of time, and they're branching out to other European countries initially, and then eventually, after the ending of the White Australia policy, which was in 1973, that was officially ended. With the ending of the White Australia policy, we start seeing more and more Asian migrants coming into Australia and other places as well. People seeking refuge from conflicts, from international wars after World War II. We've already mentioned that there was a whole bunch of migration following World War II, but after World War II, we've also got a whole bunch of other conflicts where we see a lot of migrants and refugees coming to Australia as a result. So, for example, we've got the Vietnam War. 1970 saw a large Vietnamese, Cambodian and Lao populations come into Australia from the sort of mid-70s onwards. We start seeing, with the wars in Lebanon, we start seeing lots of Lebanese migrants coming into Australia who are bringing with them the Maronite Christian rites. Afghanistan in the 1990s saw an increase of people coming in from Afghanistan, and Bosnia and Herzegovina in the 90s as well, and other countries too, like we've seen quite a recent immigration from Sudan, with a lot of Catholic adherents coming in from Sudan as well. So there's been quite a large impact as a result of all those immigration movements. So we'll go through some religions one by one. Islam is the first one. 2/3 of Australia's Muslim population in Australia are actually born overseas, or roughly thereabouts. And most of those are from the Middle East and Europe, and some from Asia as well. So most of them are actually 2/3 were actually born overseas. So we know that the majority of the Islamic population in Australia is a result of immigration. We've seen a big growth in Buddhism. It is now the second largest religion in Australia after Christianity, and we've seen that growth over the past generally 30 years, and that's mainly from Indo-Chinese peninsula. So you've got Laos, Cambodia and Vietnam, where there have been the troubles in the past, obviously the Vietnam War, etc., etc. And we've also had some recent Buddhist migration from countries like Malaysia, Hong Kong, Thailand and China. Judaism, we've had a significant number of Jews migrated to Australia from Europe after World War II, and we've had sort of steady migration of Jewish people in the years following that, but over quite a long period of time. So the numbers haven't actually increased, but they also haven't decreased, despite the population essentially doubling since World War II. Hinduism, we've had an increased number of Hindu migrants coming in from countries like Fiji and also from India as well. So the impact of immigration on Christianity, and particularly speaking Catholicism, it has the immigration post World War II has really boosted the Catholic figures. So the numbers have gone up, even though the percentage of adherents hasn't gone up that much. The actual number of adherents really has increased. It's no longer the Catholicism and Christianity in general is no longer absolutely dominated by the Anglo-Celtic Christians as it was prior to World War II. Now we have a lot of migrants from Eastern Europe who brought with them this sort of Orthodox traditions, so Greece and those sorts of countries. We've also got migrants from the Mediterranean, like Italy and Malta, who are bringing with them a strong stream of Catholic growth. Poland and Ukraine as well, from the Eastern Europe, and also from Asia as well. There's a Vietnamese population, Catholic populations in both Vietnam and the Philippines, and migration from both those countries has increased the number of Catholic adherents in Australia in the past 50 years. Also Latin America and also Africa too, as I'd already mentioned, Sudan and other countries like that. We've seen migrants coming in who are Catholic too. We've also seen lots of other Eastern Catholics arrive from the Middle East and from Europe as well. So Maronite Church has grown very large in Australia as a result of Middle Eastern and European migrants. We've also seen the Melkite Church grow, and the Ukrainian Rite Catholics have also increased as well in Australia. So what that means is that Christianity in Australia is no longer just sort of monocultural. It's no longer dominated by that Anglo-Celtic culture. It really is truly multicultural in Australia, which is quite different from what it was like before. Next point down here is what's called denominational switching, another term you need to learn. And this is where we see variants from one denomination switch to another denomination, which happens quite a bit. It's more common in some groups than it is in others. So, for example, it's far more prevalent in Protestant groups than it is in Catholic or Orthodox groups. Catholic and Orthodox groups, if you're baptised a Catholic, that you tend to not switch into another group. The same for the Orthodox tradition as well. And this is a bit of a change. This is more of a recent phenomenon because you would have had Protestants from previous generations just adhering to the church that their parents brought them up in. So younger Protestants, we use the term, they shop around a bit more for religions where they're looking for something that makes them feel welcome. That they're looking for a church where they have vibrant services. They're looking for a minister that they can relate to. They're looking for community. They might be looking for specific aspects of a community that they want to be involved in that they might not have in one church or another. Whereas in Catholicism, I suppose, in a lot of regards, depending on where you live, your local parish is your home parish, and you go to that parish just because that's your parish. So we see that a bit, and you may be given charts where you need to look at denominational switching. And there's a couple of those in the iBook, and make sure you're familiar with what they look like, because they could come up in a question you could be asked to interpret that data. And what they actually show is how many people have actually switched into the church. So you might have 15% of people might have 15% of people have actually gone into a Protestant church, and you might have 13% of people go out of the Protestant church, which means there's been a 2% increase in the number of adherents to the church. and that's the sort of data it shows, and it might show how people have come in. So they generally shows young adult retention. So how many of the young people are staying in the church for the long haul? How many people are switching in? So newcomers, that's the denominational switching. Or how many newcomers from no other church? How many people are switching in from another church? And then how many people are drifting out of the church, or how many people are dying or switching out. So drifting out is where you drift out to nothing. Switching out is where you go to another denomination. So there's a image in the iBook where it talks about the Pentecostal church, which is really where you're going to see this information come through. And what you'll see is, I'll go through an example. It was 1996 to 2001. There was an 18% growth in the Pentecostal churches. What we saw was 14% were newcomers, so they came from no religious background, but they just came along and joined the Pentecostal church. And we had 6% were young adult retention, so 6% of people were stayed there who were beyond their youth, so they stayed in there as they were becoming adults. And then we have switches in, so that means someone's coming from a Lutheran church or someone's coming from an Anglican church and they're trying out this Pentecostal church. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about people who are denominational switches, switching into these churches. And then on the obverse we have switches out. So 16% of people are switching out, so that means that they're going back to their previous religion, or they're finding their way to another religious group. So they might go back to the Lutherans or the Anglicans or whatever they happen to be. You've got 2% have died, which would indicate that figure is always going to be quite low for Pentecostal churches because they are generally young churches populated by young people. And then you have the drifters out, who drift out again from that Pentecostal church, not to go into any other churches. They just drift out and stop attending church altogether. So you do need to be able to interpret those, and I'm sure we'll go through those in class with you as well. Next point is the rise of New Age spiritualities. It's really hard. I've gone through this a little bit. It's really hard to determine, what is a New Age spirituality. But generally, we can make some sort of overarching claims or explanations about what they are. They generally promote personal fulfillment and promote personal happiness and those sorts of things, and health. They generally add meaning to a person or an individual's life. And they can be followed by themselves, but some people are sort of combining traditional religions with some of these New Age spiritualities as well, and sort of doing them in tandem. So common features, they try and develop a person's individual spirituality. There's more of an understanding that the divine exists within the person than it being some sort of transcendent being. They tend to sort of focus on mystical experiences like meditation and elevating yourself to higher states of being and higher states of consciousness and those sorts of things. They often sort of have roots in Eastern wisdom, so Buddhism and Hinduism and Taoism and those sorts of things. However, they might just take bits and pieces of these religions and make them their own. Some of them also have indigenous spiritualities sort of embedded within in them as well, particularly sort of Native American and African sort of influences too. And most of them reject the concept of monotheism, that there is sort of one transcendent being. Some do believe that there's this sort of a goddess, earth mother figure that they sometimes call Gaia. Others sort of favour polytheism, which is a belief in many gods. Others sort of believe in pantheism, which is more worship of nature, and that God is in everything, so to speak. And other favour sort of monism, that everything is part of one thing and there is no separate, everything is together kind of thing. So why are we seeing a rise in New Age spiritualities? Generally because people want choice. They want to be able to pick and choose the bits and pieces that they like and find something that they think really fits into their own personality and who they are. And they find that sort of choice liberating in today's sort of society where it's far more acceptable. And that's really important to people. So the fact that they can pick and choose and take bits and pieces from different religions and do what they feel, whatever makes them happy, so to speak. And some people feel that they can take on aspects of these spiritualities along with fulfilling their sort of their roles as adherents to Christian or Islamic or whatever other religions at the same time. And a lot of people are also quite dissatisfied with mainstream traditional religions in today's society. They don't really find them spiritually fulfilling, and they're seeking something more than what they're getting prior to that. And some people, because of a lot of the issues that we've had, particularly with churches promoting wars and issues with things like abuse cases that we have seen in some churches over time, people don't really, or people are sort of, some people rather are sort of seeing that these churches don't provide the ethical guidance that they should, and they're not sort of living up to that ideal, so they are moving away from those churches. We also had, starting in the 1960s, the social revolution, where people were encouraged to move away from their cultural, spiritual traditions and seek sort of alternative lifestyles and alternative spiritualities, and that's a trend that sort of continued through to today. And some people sort of saw that these New Age religions provide cures to some of the sicknesses that we have, and help them try to move away from some of these things, or they want to attain things like personal wealth, or they want to predict the future and those sorts of things as well. So I'm going to quickly go through some examples of some New Age religions, so you've got something to fall back on. Numerology is one where there's a focus on numbers and number patterns, and they can help people understand how people relate to one another, human existence, and how the world works, and all those sorts of things. Astrology is different because it focuses on astrological patterns and dates and when a person is born and how that influences their life. Yoga and Tai Chi, I'm sure you're all familiar with. They're from Hindu and Tao religions, which are a form of focused meditative exercise, I suppose, is one way to describe promoting health and inner peace and those sorts of things. Feng Shui originated from the Tao religion, and it's about placement of objects in the home to promote happiness and harmony and those sorts of things. Transcendental meditation is meditating to another realm or another astral plane of existence, which is beyond the physical plane that we live in this world. Paganism is one that's sort of based on ancient spiritualities. This is where you might have the mother goddess and those sorts of things, or might be nature-centered. Wicca is an example of this, where people use a term called magic to promote transformation. So there's some examples of some of the New Age spiritualities we're talking about. And finally, secularism. So secularism is the belief that religion shouldn't interfere with any part of life, or the belief that religion isn't important, or religion doesn't appeal to that person. They're a-religious, I suppose, is the way to describe it. They don't adhere to any religious or spiritual beliefs. And another word we need to look at is the word secular, which is in secularization, which is the process of becoming secular. So means less religious. So the process of secularization, we've seen that in our society. We see that with the reduction in the number of Christian adherents, with the increase in the number of people writing no religion on the census, and the declining number of people attending church services. So we're seeing that in a lot of different ways. So the reasons for the rise in secularism, there are quite a few. Pluralism is a word that you need to learn, pluralism, and that's that there's a diversity of beliefs and cultures in Australia. So we're no longer dominated by this sort of Christocentric culture where almost everyone is a Christian and that's just what everyone does. People are sort of opened up to a variety of new ideas now and don't feel that they have to adhere to that sort of that notion. So the pluralistic nature of the religious traditions and beliefs in Australian society has opened people's eyes up to the fact that you don't have to adhere to a religion, and that they can be open to secularism if that's what they choose. Individualism is another one. People not wanting to feel that they have to find fulfillment in a religious tradition, but can find it within themselves. Materialism is another one. People are more focused on personal wealth and power and all those sorts of things rather than spiritual fulfillment. So they don't see that as important in their life. As mentioned before, disillusionment with traditional religions. People find problems with traditional religions. They don't find them spiritually fulfilling. They might see that the fact that there are some issues in some some religions, and that they haven't always led by example in some cases, that they're full of hypocrisy and those sorts of things, so that has turned people away from these churches. And there's also science as well, where we've seen supernatural skepticism has come in, where people sort of are unwilling to put their faith in something beyond this world, I suppose. So that's seen people move towards secularism as well. So where have we seen this in the census? We've seen a massive growth in the number of people writing no religion on the census. In 1947, there was 0.3% of the people, and it was then that they made it clear that you don't have to put it down in the census. And then in 1971, as we've mentioned before, there was the option to write, if no religion, write none, and there we see a massive increase. So 1947, 0.3% of the population indicated that they had no religion. 1996, there was 16.1%. And then in 2001, we have 22% of the population is indicating that there's no religion. So that's almost as many as there are Catholics in Australia. So the biggest increase we're seeing in the secular movement is from young people. And we see that they might give you a graph where you're looking at the 2011 figures by age, and you can really clearly see that the young people are the ones who are mainly writing no religion on the census. And we also see this in the declining church attendees figures as well. So lots of information in that, and I'm sorry it went so long, but we really do have to have a really, really clear understanding of all the reasons for the changes to the religious landscape, and be able to articulate how that's impacted all of the religions over the time period.